Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are undertaking a really deep exploration into one of the trickiest issues in recovery, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely charged.
It is. It's that confrontation between, the highly rational, maybe educated skeptic and the whole spiritual foundation of the 12 steps.
Right.
So our mission today is really to understand the journey of the agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the person who trusts logic, trusts science, maybe trusts nothing else, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they find their very survival hinges on finding some kind of path to a, quote, higher power.
It really is the ultimate outsider's paradox, isn't it? I mean, for people who define themselves by that critical thinking, that deep-seated skepticism, the idea of spiritual surrender and recovery can feel like, well, like a betrayal of who they are intellectually.
A betrayal, exactly. They walk into a room, they see people getting better, transformation happening.
Yeah, undeniable transformation.
But then they hear this language, the language of faith, of ultimates. And it's the very language they've maybe spent a lifetime arguing against or refuting.
Yeah, it just clashes completely with their worldview.
So what we're doing today is pulling together core program literature, some really personal historical accounts, and a bit of philosophical context. We want to show how the recovery concept of a higher power isn't necessarily a demand for religious conversion. Not at all.
No, it's designed to be flexible.
Incredibly flexible. It's a framework that's so customizable, really, that it allows even the most determined agnostic to build something authentic for themselves, a life-saving spiritual anchor.
That's the key, isn't it? Finding something that works for them.
Yeah. So we're detailing that whole process from intellectual refusal, that initial no way, to acceptance, and ultimately finding a kind of peace that maybe the mind alone just couldn't provide.
Okay, so let's unpack this starting position then. What kind of, let's call it philosophical baggage, does the deeply skeptical, maybe highly educated person bring into this process?
Yeah, baggage is a good word for it.
Because they aren't just, on the fence about faith. Their skepticism is often a conclusion, right? Or hard-won intellectual stand.
Oh, absolutely. And that position is usually incredibly well defined. The literature, points this out very clearly. This person has often really wrestled with philosophy, with history.
They've done the reading.
They've done the reading.
Yeah.
And they often arrive at the conclusion that the traditional idea of God, all-powerful, purposeful, just doesn't square with observable reality. They look at the sheer amount of suffering in the world, war, illness, cruelty, just vast human stupidity, frankly.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore. And they conclude these things simply cannot be the product of any kind of loving or purposeful creation. It just doesn't compute for them.
So for them, the universe isn't some divine design. It's more like an inexplicable, maybe random phenomenon.
Pretty much, yeah. And they don't find ultimate capital T truth or ultimate goodness. What they find are, fragments, truths and goodness, lowercase, human constructs, often temporary, relative.
Okay.
And that right there is the core of their initial resistance. Because when people in recovery start talking in ultimates, God, universal purpose, divine guidance.
The capital letters.
The capital letters, exactly. The agnostic feels this immediate sense of alienation, like this isn't for me.
Even if they see it working for others.
Even then, they can be deeply impressed, genuinely impressed by the seriousness and the transformation they witness. They see it's real for others, but they instantly think, as one person put it so well, what he had was not for me. Their own intellect, which has always been their primary tool, their greatest asset, suddenly becomes their primary barrier. It's the wall they hit.
But hang on, if their greatest asset is that powerful intellect, how do they eventually accept that the only solution might involve, setting that tool aside, at least partially? Doesn't that feel deeply counterintuitive to their core identity?
Oh, it's profoundly counterintuitive. And that's exactly why they often get psychologically trapped. It's a real catch-22.
How so?
Well, for the overthinker, the alcoholic, that reliance on the mind, on sheer willpower, it becomes a kind of prison.
A prison, okay.
Yeah, the sources describe it really vividly being stuck in a spin cycle of worry and questioning, always believing that if they just try harder, analyze it more, think it through one more time,
they can crack it. They can fix it themselves.
Right. They can maintain self-reliance and control the situation through sheer force of intellect or will.
And that constant striving for control, that fierce self-sufficiency, that's what the program literature sometimes calls the old devil of willfulness, isn't it?
That's the term, yeah. Willfulness. It's that compulsion, that deep-seated drive to gain power over people, over situations, trying to force the outside world to bend to your internal wishes.
Trying to manage everything.
Exactly. But here's the profound irony, the real kicker. The very tool they rely on, the mind, is fundamentally compromised by the addiction itself. The mind, as the literature puts it, is drawn and held by the tyranny of habit.
That phrase, tyranny of habit.
Yeah.
Wow, that really connects that philosophical struggle directly to, well, our modern scientific understanding of addiction, doesn't it?
It really does. We know today, neurologically, that the brain changes. Addiction literally hijacks the reward system. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's a learning molecule. It reinforces pathways.
So the brain gets rewired.
Gets completely rewired to crave the substance, creating these deep pathways of compulsion that operate almost entirely outside the control of the conscious will. The rational part of the brain knows better, but it's overridden.
So the agnostic can know intellectually, logically, that drinking's destroying them, maybe even killing them.
Absolutely. Note that.
But the body and the addicted parts of the mind are operating under this tyranny of habit. It compels them to drink anyway, against all reason.
Precisely. The intellectual self, that inner part that knows better, becomes utterly disconnected from any kind of spiritual mooring or even basic moral guidance because the will itself is effectively hijacked. It's incapacitated.
You know, you see this struggle echoed throughout history, don't you? It reminds me of, wasn't it Augustine who talked about this?
Exactly. It's that ancient dilemma. The literature even quotes him saying something like, "We delight in thy law in the inner man." You know, the rational mind agrees.
Right.
But another law in my members warred against the law of my mind and brought me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members.
Wow. That law of sin, that's the tyranny of habit.
That's exactly it. The mind held captive even against its own reasoned better judgment, and the end result of that internal war. It's often characterized as, well, a complete break with reality. Insanity.
Can you elaborate on that concept of insanity? Because I imagine for the educated agnostic, someone who prizes rationality and order above all else, that word must be terrifying.
Oh, it is terrifying. And it doesn't necessarily mean, hearing voices in the clinical sense, though it can. More often, it's the complete loss of perspective.
Okay.
It's the inability to choose rationally, even when the consequences are staring you in the face, screamingly obvious, catastrophic.
Like knowing the stove is hot, but touching it anyway.
Exactly. But on a life or death scale, there's this one account from the early days of the fellowship. It describes a person who was so utterly deranged by alcoholism that right before they were about to be forcibly locked in a jail cell, total bottom, complete collapse, their main concern was changing into their best and newest suit.
Wow. Instead of focusing on the reality of jail.
Right. Their entire framework of thinking had become completely skewed, completely crazy. The intellect, working in isolation, had become a massive liability. It led to this total smash-up because it was focused entirely on controlling the externals. The suit, the appearance, rather than facing the internal reality, the self that was crumbling. Okay, so here's where things start to shift. Here's where that intellectual wall, that fortress of reason, finally begins to crumble.
And it's not because they suddenly get convinced by a theological argument.
Not usually, no. It falls because they face sheer pragmatic necessity. It's rooted in absolute, often physical hopelessness. Suddenly the philosophical debates they don't matter anymore.
What matters is survival.
The only thing that matters is survival. Everything else gets stripped away.
And this brings us right to the heart of step one, doesn't it? That paradox of powerlessness. The agnostic, who maybe saw themselves as the master of their own universe.
Right, the self-sufficient one.
Has to admit complete powerlessness over the addiction and admit their life has become unmanageable. It means accepting total defeat, really, on both the intellectual and the willpower fronts.
The paradox is, well, it's stunning when you really sit with it. They were totally, utterly unable to get rid of the obsession.
Despite trying everything.
Everything. Until they first admitted they were powerless over it. Before that moment, they were just trapped in this relentless cycle. You know the one?
Oh, yeah. Making solemn promises to themselves, to loved ones.
Enduring horrible suffering, detoxes, hangovers.
Vowing never again.
Never again. But then somehow the memory of the vows, the memory of the suffering, it just fades. And that internal compulsion, that feeling of being dry forever, it only lasts a little while before they pick up again.
So the intellectual arguments against, say, the concept of God, they just cease to matter when the only alternative seems to be a guaranteed spiral into death or complete insanity. Desperation becomes the lever.
Desperation is the lever that finally forces this shift. Exactly. The human mind can only sustain that delusion of self-mastery for so long when it's staring down impending doom.
It breaks eventually.
It has to. And you see this raw necessity reflected so powerfully in the source material, in people's stories. There's one account that describes that moment of just absolute rock-bottom desperation.
Yeah.
Crying out, even though they were a hardened agnostic, totally rejected any notion of God, crying out, please, God, don't let me die like this.
Just a raw plea.
A raw plea into the void, almost. And the response wasn't intellectual. It wasn't a reasoned argument. It was visceral. They describe instantly feeling a presence in the room and feeling that physical numbness, that terror actually beginning to recede. It was a spiritual experience, absolutely, but one rooted entirely in crisis, not in doctrine or belief.
That immediate felt experience, the sudden relief from that inner hell, that's the first crack in the armor, isn't it? Regardless of what they choose to call it.
It's the first undeniable piece of evidence that something other than their own willpower is at play. But you're right, the breakthrough isn't always solitary like that. It's often rooted in connecting with other people, too.
That makes sense. The fellowship.
Absolutely. The second crucial realization that really shatters that self-sufficiency model is recognizing the mutual dependence that's inherent in the fellowship.
How so?
The alcoholic comes to realize, often profoundly, that they need another alcoholic just as much as that other person needs them. It's this moment of seeing shared vulnerability, shared need, that provides the very first source of real safety and stability for many. They walk into those rooms feeling like a wretched wreck, completely broken.
Yeah, ashamed maybe.
Ashamed, terrified, and they're welcomed by people who just get it, who seem to genuinely understand without judgment, who offer patience, courtesy.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
But still, for that fiercely self-reliant, maybe proud individual, this initial act of surrender, admitting need, it must feel like failure. We really need to address that perception that submission is somehow cowardly.
Yeah, that's a huge misconception, and the literature tackles it head on. Surrender, whether you frame it as surrender to God or just surrender to the recovery process itself, it's explicitly reframed.
Yeah.
It's defined not as a cowardly act, not at all, but as a courageous decision to do a courageous thing. It takes, and I quote, a tremendous amount of courage to die to the world in which are the very roots of our being.
To die to that old self.
To die to that old self. What they're sacrificing isn't real strength. It's the false confidence, the pride rooted in that material ego, that false self that insisted against all evidence that it could manage everything alone.
So it sounds like the real failure, the real cowardice maybe, was actually clinging to that lie of self-sufficiency even when it was actively killing them.
You could absolutely see it that way, yeah.
The courage, then, is in finally facing the reality of the situation, accepting the help that's offered through that non-judgmental listening ear of the fellowship, which makes the outsider, the agnostic, feel safer, feel no longer completely alone in their isolation.
That connection is vital. It breaks the isolation, which is fuel for the addiction.
Okay, so the intellectual wall has been breached, maybe not demolished, but breached by sheer desperation, by the need to survive.
Right. Necessity wins.
And the person starts connecting with others. Now, they're faced squarely with step 2, coming to believe that a power greater than themselves could restore them to sanity.
Mm-hmm. The sanity part is key, too.
Definitely. But if that traditional concept of God is just, it's a non-starter, right? It doesn't fit. What practical sorts of strength can the skeptic lean on? Where do they find this power?
And this right here is where the program's genius, its radical flexibility, really provides the necessary escape hatch. It's crucial. For the atheist, for the agnostic, that initial higher power doesn't need to be supernatural at all. It can be the observable, tangible, collective power of the fellowship itself.
The group?
The group. The literature explicitly assures them that our own group, or AA as a whole, would suffice as a higher power. The power is seen as collective. It's the group consciousness, the shared experience, the visible results.
Okay, that's a huge pragmatic shift, isn't it? It moves the focus away from some external, maybe intangible divine being.
Right, something they can't see or prove.
To the observable miracle, you could say, of sustained recovery happening right there in the room. The individual's power failed, utterly. But the group's power, collectively, has not.
Exactly. They can literally see proof of concept all around them. And this pluralism, this willingness to accept a non-theistic power, wasn't some later adaptation. It was apparently intrinsic to the program almost from the beginning.
Really? From the early days?
Yeah. Historical accounts point this out. There were groups specifically designed to accommodate this exact viewpoint, people who couldn't stomach the traditional God talk.
I think I recall the source mentioning something about New York City.
Precisely. They highlight the existence of a group called the Humanist Group in New York City, which was apparently flourishing back in the mid-1940s.
Wow, the 40s.
Yeah. So this early evidence really confirms that the unity of the program, its strength, was always rooted in that singleness of purpose, staying sober, and helping others, not enforcing conformity to a specific religious creed.
So the agnostic can literally look around the room and say, okay, the combined sobriety, the shared strength in this room, that is a force greater than my addiction. That can be their starting point.
That is the initial higher power for many, a very real, very observable power.
But the journey doesn't necessarily stop there, does it? The program invites them, encourages them to define a power greater than themselves as they understand it. That seems to imply going beyond just the group.
It absolutely does. It opens the door for it to evolve, to expand into maybe more naturalistic concepts if that fits better for the individual.
Like what, for instance?
Well, the genius is in that personal definition, right? As we understand God. So that power could evolve into something like the integrity they see in the natural world, the mountains, the ocean,
A cosmos.
the vastness of the cosmos, the underlying order or flow of the universe, or maybe even just the abstract principle of goodness, or the moral direction the individual consciously chooses to follow.
So true spirituality in this recovery context really arises from individual experience. It deliberately steps outside of cultural tradition, specific creeds, gender norms.
Exactly. It becomes this journey of profound self-recognition and ultimately redefinition.
It sounds like it's the moment when you finally stop trying to manage and control the whole world.
Yeah, giving up that fight.
And instead, you turn inward. You start asking those deep questions. Okay, what do I actually think? What do I feel deep down? What is my truth? It allows that fragmented, addicted self to maybe start expanding into a more authentic, multifaceted self, one that's in relationship with whatever they define as the good or their higher power.
Beautifully put. And this is exactly where the philosophy of William James became so important. It provided a kind of intellectual permission structure, you could say, for early members like Bill W., who wrestled with this stuff intensely.
Okay, let's spend a moment on this because William James and pragmatism, that sounds like something that could really resonate with an educated skeptic. What exactly was James's pragmatic test of faith? How did it help?
Well, James, in his seminal work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which Bill W. read and was hugely influenced by, basically argued that the validity, the truth, if you like, of religious or spiritual experiences shouldn't be judged on doctrine or dogma,
Okay.
but should be judged by their fruits exclusively.
By their results.
By their results. Okay,
Yeah.
practical. Extremely practical. In other words, if a belief system, whether you call it God, nature, the universe, collective unconscious, or even just effective natural psychology, if it produces positive, measurable, beneficial results in your actual life,
Like staying sober.
like staying sober, becoming more honest, finding peace, if it demonstrably uproots vices, instills virtues, makes your life quantifiably better and saner, then you should embrace it. You should venerate it, regardless of its label.
So the proof isn't in the theological pudding, so to speak. The proof is in the lived experience, the sustained sobriety, the improved character, the ability to function.
That's the pragmatic test. The agnostic can effectively bypass the whole theological debate and simply evaluate the functional utility of the belief or the practice. Does it work?
If it works, use it.
If it works, use it. And James went even further. He classified faith not primarily as a theological requirement, but as a psychological and biological force. He called it a sthenic affection.
Sthenic, that's a new one on me. What does that mean?
Sthenic basically means strengthening, expansive, stimulating, life-enhancing. So faith, as James defined it, is a force by which men live. It's something that gives power, endurance, vitality.
Okay, so it's about life force, energy.
Exactly. If adopting a certain belief or practice gives you endurance, enthusiasm, a zest for living, if it literally makes you stronger and more capable of navigating life's challenges and surviving, then it is real and valid for you, functionally speaking.
I can see how that would appeal to an agnostic.
Absolutely. The agnostic in recovery can embrace this sthenic affection because the results, the fruits, are self-evident. They are alive, they are regaining their sanity, it works. That's all the proof they need initially. right? So once this pragmatic, highly customized conception of a higher power starts to take shape, whether it's the group, the universe, a set of principles, whatever.
Something tangible or conceptual they can actually connect with.
Exactly. The next big challenge, and it is a challenge, is building what Step 11 calls conscious contact with that power. The agnostic now has to figure out how to practice this connection on a daily basis.
Yeah, because for someone who's deeply analytical, maybe even cynical about religion, the idea of prayer or meditation, it often conjures up images of, religious rituals they've spent their whole lives rejecting or even mocking.
Totally. Kneeling, formal prayers, specific postures. It can all feel alienating.
So how does the program redefine this practice to make it accessible, make it doable for the skeptic?
Well, the key insight, as the literature highlights again and again, is about temporarily setting aside our desire to figure everything out.
Letting go of the analysis.
Letting go of the constant need to analyze, dissect, and control with the intellect. That's the essential. You might even say anti-intellectual move, ironically.
For the intellectual.
For the intellectual. Conscious contact in this framework isn't about reciting specific doctrines or understanding theology. It's about quieting the ego, quieting that relentless internal chatter.
The spin cycle.
The spin cycle. And making space for something else to come through, maybe intuition, maybe guidance, maybe just quiet clarity, whatever they perceive it to be. This is incredibly difficult for the overthinker, but it's ultimately incredibly freeing.
It sounds like that phrase, the noble art of leaving things undone. That really applies here, doesn't it? The wisdom of just stopping, eliminating the non-essentials.
Exactly. For the person whose mind has been perpetually trapped in that cycle of worry, analysis, and trying to fix everything, the act of doing nothing, of just being still, can be revolutionary.
So what does this practice actually look like day to day?
Well, it involves stillness, primarily. It involves consciously acknowledging one's own limits, accepting the lack of ultimate control, practicing surrender in small ways, and being open to receiving whatever comes.
Receiving insight, maybe? Or just calm?
Insight, calm, a different perspective, a moment of peace. And the beauty is the actual form of meditation practice is described as completely individual.
Just like the definition of the higher power.
Precisely. The agnostic is free to choose from any number of disciplines. It could be mindfulness, focusing on the breath. It could be walking meditation out in nature. It could simply be sitting quietly for 5 minutes and just observing thoughts without judgment.
No dogma attached to the method.
No dogma. The goal is the same across methods. Stop the internal noise, reduce the ego's dominance, and create some kind of connection, however they define it, to that power greater than themselves. The aim is to access a wisdom that feels deeper or more reliable than the intellect alone, especially the addicted intellect.
And this daily practice, this conscious contact, is essentially what maintains the spiritual condition, right? It prevents that relapse back into the old ego-driven, self-sufficient way of thinking and behaving.
That's the idea. It's maintenance, which leads us directly to the other crucial maintenance steps, particularly step 10, the daily tune-up.
The continuing personal inventory.
Exactly. So what does this unremitting inventory actually involve for the skeptic on a practical daily basis?
Yeah, how does someone who rejects sin and traditional morality do a moral inventory?
Well, it involves constant vigilance, but framed pragmatically. Vigilance against those defects of character that were so clearly fueling the addiction and making life unmanageable.
Like what, specifically?
The sources are clear. Continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. Those are the big four.
The classics.
The classics. And the inventory has to be unremitting, meaning continuous, ongoing, not just a once-a-year thing, because the inherent human tendency towards ego, towards fear, towards pride, it doesn't just vanish, it needs constant attention.
Okay, so can you give some really practical, concrete examples? What kind of questions might an agnostic who's maybe uncomfortable with terms like sin ask themselves during this daily check-in? It can't be like a traditional examination of conscience.
No, exactly. For the pragmatic agnostic, the questions are very results-oriented, very behavioral. They might ask things like, okay, looking back at today, where was I self-centered? Did my actions or words cause harm to another person, intentionally or unintentionally? Where did I try to force my own will onto a situation? And did that create conflict or problems? Was there any instance of dishonesty, even a small white lie, that compromised my integrity or created confusion?
Very practical, very observable.
Very. And if they discover, yeah, actually I was pretty selfish there, or I was definitely dishonest about that, The process doesn't stop at recognition. It requires immediate acknowledgement, just admitting it to themselves and maybe to their higher power, however conceived.
Yeah, no.
Then requesting that the defect be removed again, whether that's asking a deity or affirming their commitment to the principle of honesty. Often, discussing it with the sponsor or a trusted peer is crucial, and then making swift amends if actual harm was done to someone else.
That sounds like an enormous relief, actually. That freedom to just admit it, acknowledge it, accept responsibility for mistakes immediately.
Instead of hiding or justifying.
Right. Instead of constantly trying to maintain this false front, this narrative of being perfect or always in control or always right. That sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting, and this daily inventory marks that fundamental shift from the outward-focused controlling self.
Manager of the universe.
A manager of the universe, exactly.
Yeah.
To the inward-focused accountable self. Remember the old devil of willfulness? That was all about gaining power over people and situations, which often manifests as gossiping, stirring up drama, trying to manipulate outcomes.
Yeah.
The daily inventory forces the focus inward. You stop obsessively watching others, judging others, trying to fix others, and instead you ask that simple but life-saving question. Okay, what is going on with me?
Focusing on your side of the street.
Your side of the street. Self-pity, self-centeredness, pride, resentment, fear. Those are the defects that need daily weeding through this inventory process.
And this is all reinforced by that simple daily request that often guides the agnostic's prayer or meditation, even if they don't call it prayer. Thy will, not mine, be done.
Yeah, and that request, whether it's directed towards a cosmic intelligence, the laws of the universe, or simply the principles of recovery like honesty and humility, it works to recenter the person. It pulls them away from their own isolated, often dangerous, ego-driven plans.
It's an admission, really.
It's a daily admission that there's probably a better way, a healthier flow, a wiser path than the one the isolated, willful self insists upon. They are consciously choosing day by day, sometimes moment by moment, to try and align their actions with something better: integrity, compassion, service. And that is the true practical definition of spiritual progress for anyone, skeptic included.
Okay, this process we've been outlining, it's intense. It's a complete dismantling almost of the intellectual and emotional foundations that the skeptic might have built their entire life upon.
It really is. It demands immense effort, constant vigilance, painful honesty.
So let's talk about the payoff. What are the tangible, observable results of this, frankly, agonizing spiritual journey for the skeptical person? What do they actually get in return for making this courageous, counterintuitive decision?
Well, the sources consistently describe the results as nothing less than a new state of consciousness and being. It's profound.
A new state of being.
Yeah. The journey is characterized first and foremost by the deflation of hopelessness. That crushing weight lifts. And perhaps most critically for the alcoholic or addict, it involves significant ego reduction.
Getting over themselves, baby.
Getting over themselves, exactly. Remember, the alcoholic's troubles, according to the literature, stemmed fundamentally from that claim to specialness. That underlying belief that they were somehow unique, different, maybe smarter, maybe more sensitive, maybe just fundamentally other than the common run of humanity.
The terminal unique.
Terminal uniqueness, yeah. The recovery process forces them, through admitting powerlessness and needing others, to realize the absolute necessity of other people. The illusion of self-sufficiency shatters.
So humility in this context isn't about self-abasement or thinking you're worthless. It's the genuine, realistic realization of interdependence.
Beautifully said. That's exactly it. Humility is realized when, as one source puts it, you remember that the people you meet in the rooms out in the world are as close to God as I am ever going to get while on this earth.
Well, that's powerful.
Isn't it? That single realization just smashes the illusion of isolation. It compels them to actively seek connection, to seek knowledge of this greater purpose, whatever they conceive it to be, and crucially, to see how their own painful experience can actually help another struggling person. They move from painful isolation to life-saving community.
Okay, so the ego gets reduced, humility grows, connection happens. What about the internal world, that insanity, that inner turmoil, that spin cycle of worry and fear that characterized their active addiction? What happens to that?
According to the accounts, it disappears. It lifts. Now, the spiritual awakening itself is rarely, the lightning bolt dramatic conversion experience. More often, it's described as a quiet, gradual, but profound shift in awareness. A psychic change.
A psychic change, exactly. They stop looking for earth-shattering miracles and instead find this deep underlying feeling of serenity. A fundamental assurance that At some core level, all is well, or at least manageable, even when life inevitably throws difficulties their way. That internal chaos, the insanity, the turmoil, it's replaced by what the literature calls a new dimension of hope, love, and peace.
That sounds like, well, a complete psychological overhaul.
No.
Something that would allow them to finally engage with life fully, maybe for the first time.
That is absolutely the goal, and the program is very explicit that this isn't just about not drinking or using. That's just the ticket to the dance. The real goal is to practice these principles: honesty, humility, willingness, service in all affairs.
Everywhere. Work, family, relationship.
Everywhere. The ultimate aim is to transform the baseline difficulty of just living into something approaching the joy of living. They learn, slowly, tentatively at first, how to say yes to life.
What does that mean, saying yes to life? It means allowing life, with all its challenges and uncertainties, to happen without immediately resorting to those old defenses, the fear, the resentment, the paranoia, the self-pity that always blocked their growth and kept them stuck.
Letting life challenge you without crumbling or running away.
Precisely. And the literature draws this beautiful contrast between the old life and the new. It contrasts the sober, potentially zest-filled life.
Zest-filled, I like that.
Yeah. With the previous drunken or using life, that frantic, desperate search for what it calls the joy of a passing felicity.
Passing felicity.
Yeah.
That nails the temporary hollow nature of the addictive high, doesn't it?
Perfectly. It was always frantic, always temporary, always guaranteed to lead right back to more cares, more alarms, more misery once the substance wore off. But the recovered agnostic, the one who has found their own path, finds something different. They find that true, enduring freedom often lies in enthusiasm, which, interestingly, the root of the word means entheos, filled with God or filled with spirit. They regain the capacity to laugh genuinely from the belly. They find a profound lightness sometimes. They develop, as one writer put it, this sort of hope that makes the heart sing. So this recovery journey, even for the deepest, most ingrained skeptic, truly offers a durable freedom, a real peace that was utterly unattainable through willpower and the tyranny of the isolated intellect. So we've really charted a complex, often difficult, and definitely high-stakes journey today. It's the journey of the educated skeptic in recovery.
Yeah, a path that starts with that firm intellectual refusal of a traditional concept of God.
Right, that starts with no.
And somehow leads to a uniquely accommodating, deeply personal and pragmatic spiritual life. It's a path that clearly prioritizes personal, customized understanding as we understand God, relies heavily on collective support, and judges itself by practical, measurable results rather than adherence to any rigid creed or doctrine.
Exactly. And you could argue the whole thing works precisely because it directly addresses and deflates that central problem of the alcoholic or addict, that deep-seated claim to self-sufficiency, that illusion of specialness.
Right. By accepting their powerlessness, by hitting bottom, the agnostic is forced to embrace their own not-godness, you might say.
I like that, not godness. Yeah.
Okay.
They realize that mutual dependence, needing others, isn't a weakness. It's actually the essential condition for survival, and then maybe even for thriving.
Which brings us then to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Okay.
If the incredible success of this recovery process for millions seems rooted in this enthusiastic embrace, as one source called it, of the continuing reality of each not God needing others, if people struggling with addiction must shatter their illusion of self-sufficiency to survive and find peace, what does this radical reality of mutual dependence reveal about the nature of true maturity, true freedom, maybe even true sanity for everyone, not just those in recovery?
That's a big question.
It is. If extreme self-reliance is identified as the root of the alcoholic's misery, how much, perhaps, of general human misery, anxiety, and conflict is rooted in that same fierce, isolating insistence on individual independence above all else?
Wow. Something to definitely think about. That maybe the acceptance of necessity, that deep down we all truly need each other, isn't a failing, but might actually be the defining characteristic of real maturity.
A key insight, perhaps, delivered through the often agonizing but ultimately life-affirming journey of the agnostic seeking sanity and peace. Thank you for diving deep with us today.